Blood hit the dust. That's how it started. That's how it always started. Soldiers came like a storm of iron and anger, their horses tearing the earth. They left behind a quiet that screamed louder than any battle cry. Homes became skeletons of black timber. Prayers became smoke, thin and lost against a gray sky. She was there, in the middle of the silence. A daughter of a proud people, now just wreckage. A piece of a life someone tried to tear apart. Wounds like jagged mouths gasped at her side. The world had a name for her that night. Enemy. Something to be broken and forgotten. She crawled from the ruin, her world nothing but ash and the ghosts of names she could no longer call. Silence was supposed to be her grave. But then came a sound, the steady beat of hooves. A rhythm like a heart she didn't dare trust. The man on the horse wasn't a savior. His name was Silas, and he'd seen enough cruelty to freeze a man's soul. His past was a long road paved with empty whiskey bottles and friendships that lasted about as long as a sunset. He wasn't out there looking for anyone to save. He was just running from memories that had sharper teeth than any wolf. He saw her then, a tremble of life against the dead earth. He pulled his horse to a stop, a curse grinding out between his teeth. He didn't want this. He didn't need this. But he dismounted anyway. Her eyes, when she lifted them, held something that stopped him cold. Not fear, not pleading. It was defiance. A single, burning ember in the ashes of her world. It clung to her even as life was slipping right through her fingers. He almost turned back. He almost got on his horse and rode away, leaving her to the dust. Taking her meant trouble. It meant the town would call him a traitor. It meant wearing a brand in a place that never, ever forgot who was white and who was not. But then he saw her fingers, clawing at the dirt. A desperate, silent refusal to let go. That broke something in him. With a grunt that was half anger, half something else, he lifted her. Her blood was warm against his shirt, a stark reminder of the choice he was making. He swung her onto his horse, her breath a ragged, paper-thin sound in the stillness. He knew, right then, that if he left her, she'd be gone before the sun came up. And for reasons he couldn't untangle, he couldn't let that happen. Not again. His cabin was a small box against the vast, dark world. The only light came from the fireplace, making shadows dance like old ghosts on the rough wood walls. He laid her on his cot, the only soft place in the whole cabin. He tore strips from a clean shirt, his hands clumsy but steady. When he pressed the cloth to the wound, she bit down a scream. Her whole body went rigid, but she made no sound. He saw her knuckles turn white. That same fire he saw in her eyes was still there, burning deep inside. He found himself muttering words, soft words, things he hadn't said to anyone in years. Just nonsense, really. Assurances that the world hadn't ended, that she was still tethered to it. He didn't know if she heard him. He didn't know if he was saying them for her or for himself. The nights that followed were a quiet war, a war against fever, against infection, against the silence that filled the spaces between them. He spooned broth between her reluctant lips. He changed the bandages. He wiped the sweat from her brow when the fever dreams took her. He treated her like a job that needed doing, a stray animal he'd taken in. But his hands, they told a different story. They were patient. They were gentle, in a way that surprised even him. Of course, a secret like this couldn't stay quiet for long. Whispers in a small town travel faster than a prairie fire. The men in the saloon started laughing about him. Old Silas finally lost his mind, shacked up with an Apache squaw. The town preacher, a grim-faced man named Josiah, stopped him on the street. He warned Silas that mercy for a heathen was a sin, that God doesn't bless a man who invites weakness into his home. Even Martha, a widow who'd shared his bed on more than a few cold nights, turned away. She spat on the ground near his boots, her eyes filled with a disgust that felt like a slap. It was as if his very presence had contaminated her. He took it all. He bore the whispers and the glares and the judgment with a stone-faced silence. Every evening he'd ride back to the cabin, and every evening she'd be there. Her shadow long and silent in the firelight, a constant, quiet presence in his loud, lonely life. Then she started to move. First, just fragile steps from the bed to the hearth. Then she started following him. Her eyes never left him. When he chopped wood, she would gather the kindling into neat piles. When he rode out to check his fences, she'd tidy the cabin, her hands still trembling with weakness. The silence between them began to change. It wasn't empty anymore. It was full, heavy with things unsaid. One night, the wind was howling outside, rattling the shutters like an angry spirit. She spoke, her first word to him. "Thank you." Her voice was halting, rough with disuse. It was a thread of sound in the roaring wind, but it hit him like a thunderclap. He looked at her, truly looked at her, and was startled. He just shook his head, mumbled something about how she didn't owe him a thing. But her eyes stayed on him. And in her gaze, he felt like she saw something inside him, something he himself had buried a long, long time ago. He thought for a moment that maybe things could be simple. Maybe they could just be. He was wrong. The world outside wasn't done with them yet. The world outside came on a moonless night. It came with the swing of lanterns and the cold gleam of rifle barrels. A group of men from town. They stood in a half circle just beyond the light of his porch. Their faces were hard, set in grim lines of self-righteous anger. They didn't come to talk. They came to demand. "Give her up," they said. Their spokesman was the town sheriff, a man named Cobb, who knew Silas better than most. "This cabin can't shelter what we despise, Silas. You know the rules." Silas stepped outside. The rifle in his arms felt like a part of him. His eyes were as hard as river stones. His voice cut through the tense darkness with two sharp words. "She stays." You could feel the air crackle. The men shifted, their confidence wavering. They knew Silas. They thought he was a quiet man, a pliable man who kept to himself. They didn't expect the steel in his voice. They didn't expect the look in his eye that said he would die on this porch before he backed down. For a long, breathless moment, nobody moved. The only sound was the wind whispering through the pines. It was the kind of moment where one wrong move, one twitch of a finger, would unleash hell. But no one moved first. One by one, they lowered their rifles. Their torches dipped toward the ground. They backed away, melting into the shadows, their curses swallowed by the night. When Silas turned and went back inside, his jaw was still clenched so tight it ached. She was standing by the fire, not hiding, not crying. She had been ready to face whatever came. She met his eyes, and in that single look, everything was said. He hadn't just saved her from the mob. He had stood between her and the world's hatred. He had chosen her. Something inside her, something that had been frozen since the day of the massacre, finally broke free. She wasn't just a survivor anymore. She wasn't a remnant of a broken tribe. She was alive. And she was alive because this quiet, broken man refused to let the world erase her. As the first hint of dawn painted the sky gray, he found her in the doorway. The rising sun outlined her silhouette. The fire behind him threw her shadow long across the floorboards. It stretched all the way across the room, touching his feet. It looked like a vow, a promise he had never asked for, but now couldn't imagine living without. She had made her decision. She wasn't leaving. And that's when Silas realized the real trouble hadn't even begun. Because the mob was just the start. The real danger wasn't from the town. It was from the secret he was hiding. A secret that, if she ever learned it, would turn her gratitude to ash. The days bled into weeks. Her physical wounds healed, leaving behind scars that were like a map of her pain. But she was more than her scars. She became his shadow, not in a spooky way, in a constant way. When he rode the fence lines of his small property, she was always a few paces behind on the spare horse. When he split logs for the coming winter, she stacked the wood. He told himself it was just gratitude. A debt she felt she had to repay. But it felt like more than that. Sometimes he'd get angry. He'd mutter under his breath that he never asked for this. He never asked for her devotion, for her silent, watchful presence. But whenever he'd turn around, she'd be there. Her eyes steady, her expression unreadable, and the anger would just dissolve. The town, of course, didn't forget. A rancher's wife saw them in town getting supplies and spat on the ground near Anaba's feet. She called her a name that made Silas's hand clench into a fist. Preacher Josiah was still thundering from the pulpit every Sunday about the sinner in their midst, the man who had chained his soul to a heathen. The poison from the town was seeping in. One evening, Silas found himself seriously considering it. Saddling her horse, giving her all the supplies she could carry, and sending her deep into the hills, away from the hate, where she could be free. He tried to tell her. He stumbled over the words, trying to explain that it was for her own good. She just looked at him and shook her head. A small, simple movement. But her eyes, they held the weight of 1,000 years of survival. They told him, without a single word, that she would rather face the spit and the stones of this town than the emptiness of being alone again. That silent refusal hit him harder than any sermon, harder than any fist. He was trapped. Trapped by her devotion. Trapped by his own damn decision to pull her from the dust. Winter came, burying the world in a heavy blanket of white and silence. The cold was bitter, relentless. One night, a blizzard was raging. Silas came back from checking on the animals, half frozen. He pushed open the cabin door, and the sound that greeted him stopped him in his tracks. She was singing, a soft, low melody in her own language. It was a sound as fragile as smoke, as sad as a forgotten memory. She was sitting by the fire, her scarred hand tracing the rim of a clay bowl he'd never seen before. Her voice rose and fell, filled with a sorrow so deep it felt ancient. He stood there, dripping snow on the floor, and just listened. He couldn't understand the words, but he understood the feeling, the ache, the loss. When the song ended, the silence that followed was different. He walked over and sat down beside her, the warmth of the fire slowly chasing the cold from his bones. She did something then that she'd never done before. She reached out and placed her hand over his. It wasn't a timid touch. It was certain, firm. In the quiet cabin, with the blizzard howling outside, the truth finally settled between them. A truth that had no need for words. It wasn't gratitude that kept her here. It was something else, something fierce and powerful and terrifying, something he hadn't let himself feel in a lifetime. But just as that realization bloomed in his heart, a new, colder fear crept in. He knew her people. He knew their laws, their honor. And he knew, with a certainty that chilled him to the bone, that they wouldn't just let her disappear. Someone would come looking for her. And when they found her here, with him, they wouldn't be bringing thanks. The world proved him right, but it came from a direction he never expected. Raiders, sweeping through the valley like a plague, not soldiers, not lawmen, just hard men with empty eyes and quick guns. They stole cattle, burned barns, and left fear hanging in the air like smoke. And the same townsfolk who had cursed his name, who had spat at the woman he protected, now showed up at his door. Their faces were pale with fear. Their bravado was gone, replaced by a desperate pleading. They needed his gun. They needed his steel. They knew he was the best shot in the valley. They begged him to help them fight. Silas didn't answer right away. He looked past them, his eyes finding hers. Anaba, the woman they had scorned, the woman they had wanted to cast out. She stood in the shadows of the cabin, her expression as unyielding as the mountains. She gave a single, sharp nod. That was his answer. He turned back to the townsfolk. "I'll fight," he said, his voice low and dangerous, "but on one condition." He let his eyes move from one fearful face to the next. "She gets protection. Your word. She'll be kept safe among you, as one of your own." They grumbled. They looked at the ground. But fear is a powerful motivator. They agreed. The battle was that very night. It was a chaotic mess of screaming men, panicked livestock, and the deafening crack of gunfire. Smoke choked the air, burning his lungs. Silas fought like a man possessed, like a man who hadn't had a real cause to fight for in a very, very long time. He was good, better than good, but there were too many of them. A searing pain exploded in his side. He staggered, dropping to his knees. The world spun, darkness creeping in at the edges of his vision. He could feel the hot, sticky wetness of blood soaking through his coat. This is it, he thought. Another meaningless death in a world full of them. But then she was there. Anaba. She appeared out of the smoke and chaos like a spirit. She grabbed him, her strength surprising him, and dragged him behind the cover of a fallen wagon. She pressed her hands to his wound, her face streaked with grime and tears. She wasn't going to let him die. Her voice rose, not in a scream, but in a desperate prayer in her own tongue. The words wrapped around him, a shield against the pain and the encroaching darkness. Through it all, he felt her will. A force as strong as the earth itself, pulling him back from the edge. He blacked out. When he woke, it was days later. The first thing he saw was the familiar log ceiling of his cabin. The second thing he saw was her face. She hadn't left his side, not for a minute. She had kept the fire burning. She had cleaned his wound. She had fed him broth, just like he had once done for her. The circle was complete. He had saved her life, and now she had saved his. There was no debt between them anymore. Only a bond forged in blood and sacrifice, stronger than any spoken vow. As he lay there, weak but alive, he felt a sense of peace settle over him for the first time in years. He had faced down the town's hate. He had survived the raiders' attack. He had Anaba. He thought the war was over, but the leader of the raiders had seen her. He had seen Anaba save the white man's life, and the leader of the raiders recognized her. Because the leader of the raiders was her brother. His name was Kyle, and he wasn't just a raider. He was a man hollowed out by grief and rage. He had survived the same massacre that had almost killed his sister, Anaba. But where she had found a spark of life, he had found only a thirst for vengeance. He had gathered other survivors, other broken men, and they had become the very thing they hated. A storm that swept across the land, taking what they wanted. When he saw Anaba in the heat of battle, tending to Silas, he hadn't felt joy. He had felt a hot, sickening wave of betrayal. In his eyes, she wasn't his sister anymore. She was a traitor, a woman who had chosen to live with one of the men who had destroyed their world. He had retreated that night, but not out of fear. He was planning. He was coming back, not for cattle, not for supplies. He was coming back for her, to deliver what he saw as justice, to cleanse the stain of her betrayal with blood. Silas healed slowly. The town, true to its word, left them in peace. Some of them, anyway. The sheriff Cobb would stop by with supplies, his face awkward, his eyes full of a new grudging respect. Even Martha, the widow, left a basket of bread on their porch one morning. Small gestures, but they meant the world. Silas and Anaba fell into a new rhythm. The silence between them was now comfortable, filled with a deep understanding that went beyond language. He would watch her as she worked, her movements graceful and efficient. She would tend to his wound, her touch gentle but firm. One evening, he finally asked her. He pointed to the clay bowl she had been holding that night she sang. She picked it up, her fingers tracing the patterns carved into its side. She spoke in her halting English, telling him it was her mother's, the only thing she had left of her family. She told him about her brother, Cale, how they had been separated in the chaos, how she believed he was dead. The pain in her voice was a raw, open wound. Silas felt a cold dread snake its way up his spine. He knew. He knew with a gut-wrenching certainty who had led the raiders. He had seen the man's face in the firelight, a face that shared her high cheekbones, her dark, intense eyes. He had to tell her. But how? How do you tell the woman you love that her long-lost brother is alive and that he's a monster who wants her dead? Before he could find the words, the world made the decision for him. A lone rider appeared at the edge of their property. Not a raider. A young Apache boy, no older than 15. He carried a white strip of cloth tied to a stick, a sign of truce. Anaba saw him first. She let out a cry, a mix of shock and disbelief. She ran to meet him. Silas grabbed his rifle and followed, his heart pounding in his chest. The boy had a message from Cale. He wasn't coming to fight. He was coming to talk. He wanted a parley. He wanted to see his sister. Alone. It was a trap. Silas knew it. Anaba had to know it too. But the hope in her eyes was a fragile, desperate thing. The chance to see her brother again, to believe that some part of her old life still existed, it was too powerful to ignore. She agreed. Silas argued. He pleaded. He told her it was suicide. But she was resolute. This was her blood, her family. She had to face him. She made him promise to stay behind, to let her go alone. It was the hardest promise he ever had to make. As he watched her ride out to meet the man who wanted to kill her, Silas felt a familiar cold numbness creep back into his veins. The numbness he had felt for years, the feeling of being powerless. But then he looked down at his hands, at the rifle he held, and he knew he wasn't that man anymore. He had made a promise to her. But he had made another promise to himself a long time ago in a firelit cabin. He was going to keep her tethered to this world, no matter the cost. The meeting spot was a cluster of ancient, weathered rocks in the middle of the plain, a place of neutral ground. Anaba saw him from a distance. Kyle, taller than she remembered, harder. The boyish softness in his face was gone, replaced by sharp angles and a permanent scowl. He stood alone, his arms crossed over his chest. She dismounted, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs. She walked toward him, the silence stretching between them like a taut wire. "Brother," she whispered, the word feeling foreign on her tongue. His eyes were like chips of obsidian, cold and dead. "You are no sister of mine," he said, his voice a low growl. "You shame our people. You shame our parents' memory by lying with one of them." He gestured vaguely toward the valley, toward Silas's cabin, toward the whole world that had taken everything from them. Anaba flinched as if struck. "He saved my life. He saved your body," Kyle roared, his control finally snapping. "But your spirit is corrupted. You should have died with honor. Instead, you live in shame." He took a step closer, his hand dropping to the knife at his belt. "I have come to give you back your honor. I will send you to our ancestors, and I will burn his filthy cabin to the ground." Tears streamed down Anaba's face, but her voice was steady when she spoke. "Then you are no brother of mine. You are just a ghost, a man who died in the fire with everyone else." Cale's face twisted in a mask of fury. He drew his knife, the polished steel glinting in the harsh sunlight. This was it, the end of the line. But then another voice cut through the tension, a voice that was calm, steady, and deadly serious. "That's far enough." Silas. He was standing on a ridge overlooking the clearing, his rifle leveled. It wasn't pointed at Cale. It was pointed at the rocks just to Cale's left. He wasn't alone. Behind him on the ridge was a line of men. Sheriff Cobb, the ranchers. The very same men who had once formed a mob to drive Annaba out. They all held rifles. They were all silent, watchful. Cale froze, his eyes darting from Silas to the line of men. He was outnumbered, outmaneuvered. He looked back at Annaba, his eyes burning with a hatred so pure it was terrifying. "This changes nothing," he hissed. "I will find you, and I will finish this." He turned and walked away, disappearing into the hills without a backward glance. Annaba stood trembling, the tears finally coming in racking sobs. Silas ran to her, pulling her into his arms. He held her tight as the story of Silas and Cale's shared past spilled out. A confession of his time as a soldier, a pawn in a war he never believed in, and the chilling revelation that his unit was responsible for the very massacre that had orphaned them. The betrayal cut deeper than any knife, a chasm opening between them right there in the dust. She pulled away, her eyes filled with a new kind of horror, not for her brother, but for the man holding her. The town had stood with him. They had chosen a side. But as he held the woman he loved, a woman who now looked at him like he was the monster, Silas knew the real battle had just begun. And it wouldn't be fought with guns. It would be fought in the shattered landscape of a broken heart. The ride back to the cabin was a silent, suffocating journey. The space between them, once filled with unspoken understanding, was now a canyon of pain and betrayal. Annaba rode stiffly, her face a mask of grief. Silas felt like a ghost, his confession having ripped the soul out of their fragile world. Back at the cabin, she slid off her horse and walked inside without a word. He followed, his boots heavy as lead. For days, she didn't speak to him. She moved through the cabin like a phantom, her eyes avoiding his. The warmth was gone, replaced by an icy silence that was worse than any argument. He tried to talk to her, to explain the guilt that had haunted him for years, the self-loathing that drove him to the edge of the world. But his words were useless against the wall of her pain. He was the enemy. The face of the men who had destroyed her family, her home, her life. The fact that he had saved her was now just a cruel, twisted irony. One night, he couldn't take it anymore. He found her sitting by the cold hearth, staring into the ashes. "I can't change what I was," he said, his voice raw. "But that man is not who I am now. You changed me." She looked at him then, her eyes swimming with tears. "How can I look at you and not see them?" she whispered. "Every time you touch me, will I feel the hands of a soldier?" The question hung in the air, a devastating blow. Just when Silas thought all hope was lost, a visitor arrived. It was the preacher, Josiah. He looked different. The hard, judgmental lines on his face had softened. He held his hat in his hands, looking nervous. He asked to speak with Annaba, alone. Silas hesitated, but a look from the preacher, a look of genuine pleading, made him step outside. He paced, his gut twisting in knots, as he waited. Inside, Josiah sat down, not as a preacher, but as a man. He told Annaba a story, his story, about how, years ago, his own wife and daughter were killed by a soldier patrol, not Apache, white soldiers, men who had gotten drunk and violent. He confessed that his hatred for her people, for Silas, was a sickness born of that pain, a way to direct his rage so it didn't consume him entirely. "I looked at you," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "and I saw a heathen, a threat. But then I saw how you fought for him, how he fought for you, and I saw what I lost. A family. I was wrong. Hate is a poison, and it makes you blind." He told her that Silas had confessed everything to him weeks ago, about his past as a soldier, about the guilt he carried, about how saving her was his one act of penance in a life full of regret. "He is not the man who followed those orders," Josiah finished, his eyes meeting hers. "He is the man who defied them in his heart, and he's been paying for it ever since. Just like you. Just like me." When Josiah left, Annaba stood in the doorway for a long time. Silas watched her, not daring to breathe. She walked over to him. She reached out and took his hand. Her fingers traced the old, faded scar on his arm, a scar from a battle long ago. A battle he'd fought for a cause he didn't believe in. "We are both survivors," she said, her voice quiet but clear. "Our scars tell the same story. It wasn't forgiveness, not yet. But it was a start. It was a bridge across the canyon. They knew Cale would be back. They knew the peace was temporary. But now they would face him together. Not as a savior and a victim, not as a soldier and a survivor, but as two people, bound by a shared history of pain and a fragile, stubborn hope for the future. Years passed like seasons. The cabin grew, another room added for a boy with his mother's dark hair, and then another for a girl with her father's pale, steady eyes. The laughter of children became the new sound of the valley, slowly washing away the echoes of gunfire and hate. The town healed. Sheriff Cobb became a regular visitor, sharing coffee and stories. Martha taught Annaba how to bake bread. Preacher Josiah's sermons were now about forgiveness and mercy, his voice carrying the weight of a man who had stared into the abyss of his own hatred and chosen to step back. The land, which had soaked up so much blood, now yielded harvests. The family built a life, stitched together with hard work, quiet love, and the kind of peace that only comes after a long war. One summer evening, as fireflies began to rise from the tall grass, Silas stood on the porch, leaning against a post. Annaba came and stood beside him, resting her head on his shoulder. Their children were chasing each other in the yard, their shrieks of joy floating on the warm air. His body was older now. The wound in his side still ached when the weather turned cold, a constant reminder of the price of their peace. He whispered, mostly to himself, "I never asked for any of this." She turned her head, her eyes gleaming in the twilight. A small, knowing smile touched her lips. "It did not matter what you asked for, Silas. Love chose you, the way the earth chooses to bloom after a long, hard winter." He knew the world beyond their fences hadn't changed completely. Prejudice was a stubborn weed, but he was no longer the man who would have ridden past a broken figure in the dust. Annaba had reshaped him, her quiet strength and unwavering heart giving him a life he never knew he wanted. He slipped his hand into hers, their fingers lacing together in a familiar, comforting grip. The children's laughter faded as dusk settled over the valley, but their future burned bright against the darkening horizon. The shadows of the past were still out there, but they no longer had the power to haunt him. He had found his redemption, not in a grand gesture, but in the quiet, everyday rhythm of a life he had built from the ashes. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to like and subscribe for more tales of survival and the human spirit. Let me know in the comments what you think. Can a person truly escape their past?